The howling started just after sunset, echoing across the Montana plain, a symphony of. Samuel Mackenzie wiped the sweat from his weathered hands and set down his hammer. After 30 years working cattle on the frontier, he knew the difference between a pack hunting deer and something far more desperate. This wasn't the sound of wolves on the hunt. This was the sound of wolves defending territory. What he discovered that night would change everything he thought he knew about courage, honor, and the invisible bonds that connect all living so vast. Samuel stood on his porch, scanning the darkening. His ranch sat in a valley between rolling hills, isolated. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles, and the closest town, Bitter Creek, lay a full day's ride. He'd chosen this isolation deliberately. After losing his wife Martha to fever 3 winters back, solitude had become his only companion. The howling grew more intense, more urgent. Samuel grabbed his rifle from inside the cabin and stepped into the cool evening air. Years of living on the edge of wilderness had taught him that ignoring such sound could prove fatal. Wolves rarely approached his property, but when they did, it usually meant they were either starving or protecting something precious. He saddled his horse, a sturdy brown mare named Patience, and rode toward the source of the commotion. The sound led him north, toward a rocky outcropping where a small creek wound between boulders and stunted pine trees. As he drew closer, the howling became more frantic, mixed with high-pitched yelps and the unmistakable sound of snapping jaws. Then he heard something that made his blood run cold. Beneath the wolves' chorus, barely audible but unmistakably human, came the soft whimper of a child. Samuel dismounted and approached on foot, rifle ready. The scene that greeted him defied everything he'd learned about wolves in 3 decades on the frontier. 7 large gray wolves had formed a protective circle around something at the base of a boulder. They weren't attacking, they were defending. And in the center of their circle, pressed against the cold stone, sat a native child who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The boy wore traditional clothing, but it was torn and blood-stained. His dark eyes were wide with terror, yet he wasn't. He sat perfectly still, as if he understood that any sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile truce existed between him and the pack surrounding him. Samuel had never seen anything like it. Wolves attacking humans was rare enough, but wolves protecting a human child was beyond comprehension. Yet here they stood, hackles raised, facing outward, ready to fight any threat that approached their unlikely charge. One of the larger wolves, clearly the pack leader, noticed Samuel's approach and let out a low, rumbling growl. The others followed suit, but none moved from their protective formation. Samuel raised his rifle, but something in the scene made him hesitate. These weren't rabid animals acting on instinct. There was intelligence in their purpose in their positioning. The child looked directly at Samuel and spoke a single word in what sounded like Lakota. Samuel didn't understand the language, but the meaning was clear in the boy's tone. Help. Samuel faced an impossible choice. Any sudden movement might trigger the pack to attack, but leaving the child was unthinkable. He'd heard stories of wolves raising human children in distant lands, but never anything like this in Montana territory. The boy was clearly in distress, probably lost, separated. Slowly, Samuel lowered his rifle and took a step back. He began speaking in the calmest voice he could manage, the same tone he used with spooked cattle. Easy now, folks. Nobody needs to get hurt here. I'm just trying to help the little one. The pack leader's ears twitched at the sound of Samuel's voice, but the growling continued. Samuel noticed something else, something that changed everything. One of the wolves, a smaller female on the left side of the circle, was badly injured. A deep gash ran along her, and she favored her left front paw. Then he saw the arrows. 3 wolves bore the unmistakable marks of arrowhead, though the shafts had been broken. These animals weren't protecting the child from Samuel. They were protecting him from whoever had wounded them. The child wasn't their prisoner or their prey. He was their response. Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Somewhere out there, someone had attacked this pack while they were protecting the child. But why? And who would fire on wolves that were clearly defending rather than threatening? The answer came with the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. 6 riders appeared from the darkness, their faces painted with war paint, weapons drawn. But these weren't the child's to him. Samuel could tell immediately from the boy's reaction. The child pressed himself harder against the boulder, and the wolves' defensive posture became even more aggressive. The lead rider, a tall man with cruel eyes and a cavalry saber at his side, reined in his horse just outside the wolves' defensive perimeter. When he spoke, his accent revealed him to be white, but he wore the clothing and war paint of a native warrior. "Well, looks like the mutts found themselves a friend." Samuel's hand tightened on his rifle. "What's your business here?" The man smiled, revealing teeth stained with name's Dutch Kilpatrick. "These boys and me were in the business of collecting bounties. Territory's paying good money for Indian scalps these days. That little one there is about—" Samuel felt sick. He'd heard rumors of such men, white renegades who disguised themselves as native warriors to collect bounties on both sides of conflicts. They were the worst kind of predators, profiting from hatred and fear, while loyalty to no one but themselves. "The child's under my protection now," Samuel, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. Dutch laughed. "Your protection? Mister, you're outnumbered 6-1, and there's 7 hungry wolves between you and that boy. I'd say your protection ain't worth much." One of Dutch's men, a younger fellow with nervous eyes, shifted in his saddle. "Dutch, maybe we should just leave. This ain't worth dying over." Dutch's expression darkened. "Nobody's leaving until we finish what we came for. That boy's people killed my brother at Little Bighorn. I've been tracking this particular family for 3 months." Samuel understood then. This wasn't just about bounty money. This was personal vengeance disguised, and that made Dutch Kilpatrick the most dangerous kind of enemy. The pack leader seemed to sense the increasing tension. His growl deepened, and the other wolves began to pace within their protective circle. The injured female was weakening, but she maintained her. Samuel made a decision that would echo through the rest of his life. "Dutch, I'm going to make you a deal. You and your boys ride out of here now, and I won't report your bounty hunting to the territorial authorities. You stay, and things get complicated fast." Dutch spat into the dirt. "What makes you think you're in a position to make deals?" Samuel smiled grimly. "Because you need that boy alive to collect your bounty, and those wolves aren't going to let you. But me? I don't care about bounty or revenge. I just scared child who needs help, and I'm willing to bet my life that those wolves understand the difference between a protector and a predator." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Dutch's men exchanged uncertain glances. The wolves maintained their defensive formation, but Samuel noticed the pack leader's attention shifting between Dutch and himself, as if evaluating each man's intent. Then the child did something extraordinary. He spoke again, this time in broken English. "Wolves, save me! Bad men kill family. Wolves fight for me." The simple words hit Samuel like a physical blow. This child had watched his family die at the hands of Dutch's gang, and somehow, inexplicably, a pack of wolves had chosen to protect him. The arrows in their sides weren't from defensive wounds. They were battle scars earned while defending an innocent. Dutch snarled at the child's words. "Shut your mouth. Your speaking days are numbered." That was the final. Samuel raised his rifle and aimed directly at Dutch's chest. "No, they're not." The confrontation that followed would become legend in the territory, though few would ever believe the true detail. Dutch drew his saber, and his men reached for their weapons. But before anyone could fire a shot, the pack leader made a decision that defied all natural law. The great gray wolf looked directly at Samuel, then stepped aside. It was an invitation, a gesture of trust from one protector to another. Samuel didn't hesitate. He walked forward into the circle of wolves, knelt beside terrified him in his. The boy was shivering with cold, but he was uninjured beyond a "What's your name?" "Little Bear." "Well, Little Bear, you're safe now. These wolves, they're good people, and so are some of the regular folk, if you know where to look." Dutch roared in fury at seeing his prize slip away. "You've just signed your death warrant, rancher." But as he spurred his horse forward, the wolves moved as one. 7 gray shadows flowed around Samuel and Little Bear like water, forming an impenetrable wall of fangs and fury. The horses reared in terror, and Dutch's men fought to control their mounts. In the chaos that followed, Dutch fired his pistol while missing everything but the darkness. His men, realizing they were outmatched by both wolves and righteousness, began to retreat. Dutch cursed them as cowards, but he was forced to follow as the pack advanced, driving the invaders back into the night. Samuel found himself alone with Little Bear and 7 wolves, under a sky full of stars. The child had fallen asleep against his chest, exhausted by terror and relief. The wolves maintained their vigilant circle, but their aggression had faded. They were no longer defenders in a battle. They were guardians keeping watch over the innocent. The injured female wolf approached slowly. Samuel remained perfectly still as she sniffed his hand, then gently licked his finger. It was a gesture of acceptance, gratitude. These magnificent creatures understood what he had. Samuel spent the rest of the night by the creek, watching over Little Bear, while the wolves took turns resting and standing. As dawn approached, he knew he faced another impossible decision. Where could he child? The nearest native settlement was weeks away, and he had no way of knowing which tribe Little Bear belonged to, or if any of his people had survived Dutch's attack. But as the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Samuel discovered that the decision had been made for him. They came with the sunrise, silent as shadows, emerging from the landscape as if the earth itself had given them birth. At first, Samuel saw only a few figures on horseback in the distance. Then more appeared, and more, until the hills around his ranch were alive with mounted warriors. 200 Lakota warriors, their faces painted for war, their weapons ready, their horses champing at the bit, anticipative of battle. They had tracked Dutch's gang through following the trail of broken arrows and wolf blood that told the story of Little Bear's. Samuel's heart hammered as he realized the situation. He sat on his porch steps, Little Bear sleeping peacefully in his arms, while an entire war party surrounded his property. Any sudden movement could trigger a conflict that would end with his death and the child's return to danger. But then he noticed something that gave him hope. The warriors weren't approaching. They were simply watching, waiting. Their leader, a tall man with eagle feathers in his hair and scars that spoke of many battles, rode slowly forward until he was just beyond rifle range. The chief spoke in Lakota, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air. Little Bear stirred at the sound and opened his eyes. When he saw the warriors, his face lit up with joy and relief. "Grandfather," he called out in English, then switched to rapid Lakota. The chief's stern expression softened at the sound of the child's voice. Little Bear wriggled out of Samuel's arms and ran toward the warriors, but stopped halfway and looked back. He said something in Lakota to his grandfather, pointing at Samuel and gesturing toward where the wolves had disappeared into the dawn shadow. The chief listened carefully, his eyes never leaving Samuel's face. Then Little Bear did something that brought tears to Samuel's weathered eye. The child ran back to the porch, threw his small arms around Samuel's neck, and whispered in English, "Thank you, wolf friend." The conversation between Little Bear and his grandfather continued for several minutes. Samuel caught enough of the boy's tone to understand that he was telling the story of the rescue, explaining how the wolves had protected him and how Samuel had driven off Dutch's. When Little Bear finished speaking, the chief dismounted and walked slowly toward the porch. Samuel stood, his hand resting casually near his rifle, but making no threatening moves. This was a moment that required diplomacy, not weapon. The chief stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and studied Samuel with eyes that seemed to see straight through to. When he spoke, his English was clear and "My grandson tells me you stood with the wolves against the scalp hunters. Is this true?" Samuel nodded. "Yes, sir." The boy needed help, and those wolves were doing their best to provide it. Seemed like the right thing to do. The chief was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that Samuel would remember for the rest of his life. "The wolves are sacred to our people. They choose their allies carefully. If they accepted you as a protector of Little Bear, then you are a man of honor." He gestured to the warriors surrounding the ranch. "These men have ridden through the night, ready to make war on whoever harmed my grandson. They expected to find enemies to. Instead, they find a man who risked his life to save a child not his own. This is a great puzzle." Samuel felt the weight of 200 pairs of. No puzzle, just seemed like the right thing to do. The chief smiled then, the first time his stern features had shown warmth. "You call me chief, but you do not know my name. I am Red Cloud, war leader of the Oglala Lakota. And you, wolf friend, what are you called?" Samuel's knees nearly buckled. Red Cloud was one of the most famous war chiefs in the territory, a man who had fought the U.S. Army to a standstill and forced them to abandon forts along the Bozeman Trail. Standing on his porch was the equivalent of meeting a living legend. "Samuel Mackenzie, sir. I run cattle in this valley." Red Cloud nodded thoughtfully. "Samuel Mackenzie, You have done a great service for my family and my people. Little Bear is not just my grandson. He is the son of my daughter, who was killed 3 days ago when the false warriors attacked our hunting party. He is all that remains of her in this world." The weight of those words settled on Samuel like a heavy blanket. Little Bear wasn't just any child. He was the last living connection Red Cloud had to his daughter, and Samuel had saved him. "I am sorry for your loss, Chief Red Cloud." Little Bear spoke of his family. "I can't imagine the pain you're feeling." Red Cloud's expression grew hard again. "The pain will be answered. The false warriors who wear our paint while serving the white government will pay for their crimes. But first, we must honor those who showed courage when courage was needed." He turned and spoke in Lakota to his warriors. The response was immediate and overwhelming. 200 warriors raised their weapons high and let out a war cry that echoed across the valley like thunder. But this wasn't a cry of aggression. It was a salute, an acknowledgement of respect from one warrior culture to a man who had proven himself worthy of. When the echoes faded, Red Cloud spoke again. "Samuel Mackenzie, my warriors and I will remain here until the sun reaches its highest point in the sky. We do this to show all who might be watching that you are under the protection of the Lakota Nation. Any who would harm you must first fight us." Samuel was speechless. He had expected to be captured or killed when the warriors arrived. Instead, he was being granted one of the highest honors possible, the public protection of Red Cloud's war party. That's very generous, Chief, but I'm not sure I deserve such treatment." Red Cloud studied him with those penetrating eyes. "Deserve? You stood alone against 6 armed men to protect a child not your own. You earned the trust of wolves who had never seen you before. You asked for no reward, expected no gratitude. In our culture, such actions define a man's true character." Little Bear, who had been standing quietly beside his grandfather, tugged on Red Cloud's arm and spoke in Lakota. The chief listened, then smiled. "My grandson wishes to give you something. Among our people, when someone saves a life, the saved person owes a debt that can only be repaid with a gift of equal value. Little Bear has very little, but he wishes to give you what he treasures most." The child reached into his shirt and pulled out a small leather pouch on a cord around his. He opened it carefully and removed something that made Samuel's breath catch. It was a wolf tooth, carved with intricate symbols and polished to a gleaming white. Little Bear held it out to Samuel with both hands, his young face serious with the importance of the moment. "Little Bear says this was given to him by his mother," Red Cloud translated. "She told him it would protect him from harm and guide him when he was. He believes it worked because of the wolves, and it brought you." Samuel knelt down to accept the gift, understanding that this moment was far more significant. Fully. "Thank you, Little Bear. I'll treasure this always." As he placed the cord around his neck, Samuel felt something shift in the world around him. The wolves had seen something in him worth trusting. Red Cloud's warriors were honoring him as a man of courage, and now a child was entrusting him with his most precious possession. For 30 years, Samuel had lived as a solitary man, believing that isolation was safety and that caring led only to loss. But in one night, surrounded by wolves and warriors, he had discovered something he had forgotten since Martha's death, that true strength came not from standing alone, but from standing for others they couldn't stand for. The morning sun climbed higher, and, true to his word, Red Cloud prepared to depart when it reached zenith. But before the war party left, he had one final conversation with Samuel. "The false warriors who killed my daughter, they will not give up easily. Dutch Kilpatrick has made this personal, and men like him do not forgive those who stand in their way. You may see them." Samuel nodded grimly. "As much, but a man can't live his life afraid of bullies and killers. If they come back, I'll deal with them. Red will not face them alone. From this day forward, you are known to the Lakota Shunka Thawicho Koda, which means friend of the wolf. Any Lakota who sees you in need will offer aid. Any who would harm you will face our justice." He paused, then added something that sent chills down Samuel's spine. "And the wolves, they remember their friends. Do not be surprised if you find yourself with unexpected allies in dark times ahead." As the war party prepared to leave, Little Bear ran to Samuel one last time. In his halting English, he said, "I come back someday. Visit Wolf Friend. Bring stories." Samuel knelt and hugged the boy tightly. "You're always welcome here, Little Bear. always. The warriors departed as silently as they had arrived, flowing across the landscape like a river of determination and purpose. Red Cloud raised his hand in a final salute, before disappearing over the ridge, taking Little Bear to Samuel stood alone on his porch, the carved wolf warm against his chest, watching the empty. His life had changed forever, space of one night, one more. He was no longer just a solitary rancher in the Montana Territory. He was something far more significant, a bridge between worlds that were supposed to be enemies. The implications of this transformation became clear over the following weeks. Word of the incident spread through the territory with the speed of wildfire, but like most legends, the truth became twisted in the telling. Some claimed that Samuel had made a pact with devils disguised as wolves. Others insisted he had sold his soul to Red Cloud in exchange for protection. A few even suggested that he was secretly an Indian agent working to undermine white settlements. But among the native tribes of the region, a different story took root. They spoke of the white rancher who had earned the trust of wolves and the respect of Red Cloud himself. They told their children about the man who proved that courage and compassion could exist in anyone, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke. Dutch Kilpatrick, true to Red Cloud's prediction, did not forget or forgive. Throughout that summer, he and his remaining gang made several attempts to catch Samuel alone and vulnerable, but each time something inexplicable happened to thwart their plans. Once, as Dutch prepared an ambush near Samuel's property line, his horses bolted in terror when a pack of wolves appeared on a distant ridge, howling in the night. Another time, a sudden rockslide blocked the canyon pass his gang was using to approach the ranch, forcing them to take a longer route that gave Samuel time to spot their approach and prepare his defenses. Most unsettling of all, Dutch's men began reporting strange dreams and omens. They spoke of being watched by glowing eyes in the darkness, of hearing wolf howls that seemed to carry warnings, of finding their campsites surrounded by wolf tracks each morning despite having seen no wolves the night. One by one, Dutch's followers abandoned him, claiming that they had been cursed by association with his vendetta against the wolf friend. By autumn, Dutch rode alone, a bitter and increasingly unstable man consumed by his need for revenge. Samuel, meanwhile, found his isolation gradually transformed into something richer and more meaningful. Lakota hunting parties would occasionally stop at his ranch to trade for supplies, always treating him with respect and friendship. They shared news from across the territory, warned him of approaching storms or dangerous men, and sometimes brought gifts of beautifully crafted tools or weapons. Most importantly, they brought news of Little Bear. The boy was thriving among his people, learning the skills of a warrior while never forgetting his debt to the wolf friend. He had begun training with the tribal elders, showing unusual wisdom and maturity for his age. Some said he possessed a special connection to the spirit world, a gift that had manifested during his night of protection by the wolf. As winter approached, Samuel prepared for the cold months with a sense of anticipation rather than dread. He had enough supplies to last until spring, and his cattle were healthy and well protected. But more than that, he had something he hadn't possessed in years, a sense of purpose that extended beyond mere survival. The test of that purpose came with the first major snowstorm of the season. Samuel woke to the sound of scratching at his door, a persistent pawing that initially made him think one of his cattle had wandered too close to the cabin. But when he opened the door, he found himself face to face with a lone wolf, its gray fur dusted with snow, its breath visible in the frigid air. It was the pack leader from that night by the creek, somehow recognizable despite the months that had passed. The great wolf looked directly at Samuel, then turned and trotted a few steps toward the forest before looking back expectantly. Samuel didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat, rifle, and a lantern, then followed the wolf into the storm. The journey through the snow-laden forest was treacherous. The wolf seemed to know exactly where it was going. It led Samuel nearly 2 miles through dense woods and across frozen streams until they reached a small clearing where a terrible sight awaited them. Dutch Kilpatrick sat slumped against a fallen tree, his horse dead beside him, his face blue with cold, and his lips nearly black with frostbite. The man who had terrorized the territory with his false war paint and bounty hunting was now just another victim of the unforgiving wilderness. But he was. Samuel could have walked. Dutch had tried to kill him multiple times, had murdered Little Bear's family, had spread lies and hatred throughout the territory. No one would have blamed Samuel for leaving his enemy to freeze to death in the. Instead, Samuel knelt beside Dutch and checked his pulse. It was weak but steady. The man was unconscious but breathing, probably suffering from exposure and exhaustion rather than fatal injury. The wolf watched from the edge of the clearing as Samuel made his decision. He couldn't carry Dutch back to the ranch alone, not through the storm. But he could build a shelter, start a fire, and try to keep the man alive until the weather cleared. It took hours of work in the howling wind and driving snow. Samuel cut pine boughs for insulation, cleared a space for a fire, and dragged Dutch into the makeshift shelter. He shared his own coat and body heat with the man who had sworn to kill him, forcing warm broth between Dutch's cracked lips when he briefly regained consciousness. The wolf remained nearby throughout the night, sometimes pacing the perimeter of the sometimes lying just outside the shelter, as if standing guard. Its presence was oddly comforting, a reminder that Samuel wasn't alone in the wilderness. When dawn broke clear and cold, Dutch was coherent enough to speak, though his voice was barely a whisper. "Why?" he croaked, staring at Samuel with confusion and suspicion. "Why didn't you leave me to die?" Samuel considered the question. He tended the fire. "Because that's not who I am, Dutch. It's not who you have to be." Dutch laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the morning air. "You don't know what I've done. The people I've killed, the families destroyed. I don't deserve mercy." "Maybe not, Samuel, but Little Bear didn't deserve to watch his family die, and those wolves didn't deserve to be shot full of arrows for protecting him. None of us get what we deserve in this life, Dutch. We just get what we choose to do with what we're given." The conversation that followed would haunt both men for the rest of their lives. Dutch, weakened by exposure and facing the reality of his mortality, finally spoke honestly about the hatred and pain that had driven him to become a bounty hunter. He talked about his brother's death at Little Bighorn, about the crushing debt that had forced him to take desperate measures, about the slow corruption of his soul as violence became his only means of. Samuel listened without judgment, understanding for the first time that Dutch wasn't evil by nature, but broken by circumstances. It didn't excuse his actions, but it explained them in a way that made forgiveness possible, if not easy. When the weather cleared enough for travel, Samuel helped Dutch back to the ranch and tended his injuries for 3 more days. During that time, a strange transformation occurred. Dutch began to speak of his crimes not with pride or defiance, but with genuine remorse. He asked questions about Samuel's life, about his relationship with the Lakota, about the night the wolves had chosen sides in a conflict between honor and hatred. On the morning Dutch was strong enough to ride, he made an announcement that shocked Samuel to his core. "I'm turning myself in to the territorial authorities," Dutch said quietly. "It's time to face what I've done and try to make what amends I can." Samuel stared at him. "Dutch, they'll hang you. You know that, right? There's paper out on you from here to California." Dutch nodded calmly. "I know, but hanging's better than what I've been doing to myself all these months. And maybe if I face justice honestly, some of the families I've wronged will find peace." He paused, then added something that would echo in Samuel's memory forever. "You saved my life, Mackenzie, not just from freezing, but from becoming something even worse than I already was. I owe you for that." Dutch Kilpatrick rode away that morning straight toward Bitter Creek and the territorial marshal's office. Samuel never saw him again, but he heard the rest of the story through the network of traders and travelers who passed through the territory. Dutch had indeed turned himself in, confessing to dozens of crimes and providing information that led to the arrest of several other bounty hunters and false warriors. He spent his final weeks in jail, writing letters to the families of his victims, apologizing for his actions, providing lost relatives that brought closure to many grieving people. He was hanged on a cold December morning, but those who witnessed the execution reported that he faced death with dignity and peace, his final words being a request for forgiveness from those he had wronged. The story of Dutch Kilpatrick's transformation spread throughout the territory, becoming intertwined with the legend of the Wolf Friend rancher. People began to understand that something profound had happened in the Montana wilderness, something that challenged their assumptions about justice, mercy, and the possibility of redemption. For Samuel, The winter passed quietly but not lonelily. Lakota hunters continued to visit, sharing news and friendship. The wolf pack appeared occasionally on his property, always at a respectful distance, but their presence had become a source of comfort rather than concern. And sometimes, on clear nights when the stars seemed close enough to touch, Samuel could swear he heard Little Bear's laughter carried on the wind, a reminder that hope and innocence could survive even in the harshest circumstances. Spring brought a surprise that would cement Samuel's reputation as a bridge between worlds. A delegation of territorial officials arrived at his ranch, led by Governor Benjamin Potts himself. They had come to discuss Samuel's unique relationship with Lakota and his potential role as an informal mediator in ongoing conflicts between white settlers and native tribes. Mr. Mackenzie, Governor Potts, they sat on, you've accomplished something that our military leader and diplomat have failed to. You've earned genuine respect and trust from Red Cloud. The territory needs men like you, men who can build understanding instead of walls. Samuel was reluctant to accept any official role, but he agreed to serve as an informal liaison, helping to resolve disputes and misunderstandings before they escalated into violence. Over the following years, his ranch became an unofficial neutral ground where Lakota leaders and territorial officials could meet to discuss mutual concerns. But the most meaningful moment came 2 years after the wolf rescue, when Red Cloud himself arrived at Samuel's ranch with a special guest. Little Bear, now 8 years old and tall for his age, jumped down from his grandfather's horse and ran to embrace Samuel with the enthusiasm of a child who had never forgotten kindness shown in a dark hour. "Wolf friend," Bear called out in English, that had improved dramatically since their first meeting. "I have stories to tell you." The boy had indeed brought stories, training of the lessons he was learning about leadership, responsibility, and of the special role he was being prepared to play as a future peacekeeper between his people and the white world. But he had also brought something else, news that would complete the circle of honor that had begun that night. The wolf pack said excitedly, "They have new cubs, 7 of them born this spring. Grandfather says they are the children of the wolves who protected me, and they carry the spirit of friendship in their blood." Red Cloud smiled at his grandson's enthusiasm. "Little Bear has asked him to bring you to see the cub if you are willing. The pack has made its den, a valley known only to it. Would be a great honor for any white man to visit such a." Samuel felt tears sting his eyes. "The honor would be mine, Chief, all mine." The journey to the wolf den took them deep into Lakota territory, through landscapes of breathtaking beauty that few white men had ever seen. They traveled for 3 days, camping under stars that seemed to shine with special brightness, sharing meals and stories around fires that warmed more than just their bodies. When they finally reached the valley the pack had made its den, Samuel understood why the Lakota considered it. Towering pine trees surrounded a crystal-clear lake, reflected the sky like a mirror. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and the air itself seemed to hum with peace. The wolves were waiting for them, as if they had known their visitors were coming. The pack leader, now showing gray around his muzzle but still magnificent in his bearing, approached Samuel without fear or hesitation. Behind him came the female who had been injured that night by the creek, now healthy and strong, followed by 7 cubs who tumbled over each other in their eagerness to explore. Little Bear laughed with delight. The cubs swarmed around him, accepting him as an old. One of the smallest cubs, bolder than its siblings, approached Samuel and sniffed his hand with the same careful evaluation its parents had shown years before. When the cub licked Samuel's fingers, just as its mother had done, Samuel felt the completion of something that had begun the night. He chose to step into a circle of wolves and trust in the power of protection over violence. "The cubs know you," Red Cloud observed with satisfaction. "The old ones have taught them that you are family, that your scent means safety, and your presence brings no harm." Samuel knelt among the wolf cubs, Little Bear beside him, both of them laughing as the young wolves investigated every pocket and bootlace. Boundless curiosity. In that moment, surrounded by new life and old friendship, Samuel understood the true meaning of the gift he had been given. It wasn't just about one night of courage or one act of compassion. It was about the ripple effects of choosing hope over fear, understanding over hatred, mercy over vengeance. The wolf cubs represented a future where such choices might become easier, where the bonds between all living things might grow stronger rather than weaker. As they prepared to leave the sacred valley, Little Bear gave Samuel one final gift. The boy had carved a small wooden wolf painted with traditional symbols and blessed by the tribal elders. On its base he had scratched words in English that brought tears to Samuel's eyes. "For Wolf Friend, who showed me that family comes in many forms, and courage means protecting those who cannot protect themselves." The journey back to Samuel's ranch was bittersweet, filled with the knowledge that such perfect moments were rare and precious. But as they said their farewells, Red Cloud offered words that would sustain Samuel through all the years to come. "You will always be welcome among the Lakotas as a guest, but as family. The wolves chose you. Little Bear claimed you, and we have accepted. These bonds do not break with time or distance." Samuel lived for many more years on his ranch, continuing to serve as a bridge between worlds that were slowly learning to coexist rather than simply endure each. He never married again, but he was never lonely. Lakota families would visit during hunting seasons. Territorial officials would stop by for advice on native relations, and travelers from across the frontier would detour to meet the legendary Wolf Friend rancher. The wolf pack continued to thrive in their sacred valley, and their descendants would occasionally appear on Samuel's property, maintaining the ancient bond of respect and protection that had been forged in a moment of crisis and choice. Little Bear grew into a respected leader among his people, known for his wisdom in dealing with both Lakota and white concerns. He visited Samuel regularly throughout his youth, and their friendship became a symbol of what was possible when people chose to see beyond surface differences to the deeper connections that bound all beings together. When Samuel finally passed away in his sleep at the age of 78, representatives from dozens of native tribes attended his funeral alongside territorial officials, local ranchers, and ordinary folks whose lives he had touched in ways both large and small. It was said that during the service, wolves could be heard howling from the distant hills, a final salute to the man who had proven that courage, compassion, and the willingness to stand for what was right could overcome the strongest barriers between supposedly hostile. The wooden wolf carving Little Bear had given him was buried with Samuel, along with the original wolf who had started their unlikely friendship. But the legacy of that night by the creek, when a man chose to trust in the wisdom of wolves and the innocence of a child, lived on in the stories told around campfires and the lessons passed down to a new generation. They said that on quiet nights, when the moon was full and the wind was still, you could sometimes see the ghostly figure of a rancher walking among wolves in the hills above the old Mackenzie, still keeping watch over the innocent, still building bridges between worlds that needed to learn stronger together than apart. And in the sacred valley where the wolf cubs had played, Little Bear, now an elder himself, would bring his own grandchildren to hear the story of how their ancestors learned that true strength comes not from the ability to destroy enemies, but from the wisdom to recognize that sometimes what we think of as enemies are really just friends we haven't understood yet. The howling that had started it all, that symphony of protection and loyalty that had echoed across the Montana plains on a cold autumn night, had become something far greater, a song of hope that would continue to resonate as long as there were those willing to listen for the sound of courage calling across the dark, summoning ordinary people to do extraordinary things in the name of love.